Hello YouTube, my name is Matt. This is a review of how I was able to succeed in my very first pronghorn hunt ever. Now it's a solo hunt, do-it-yourself, Colorado public land pronghorn hunt. And I was able to be successful, and I wanted to share a few tips on how I was able to put this hunt together and arrive at a positive result. And hopefully you'll find it useful. If you do, maybe subscribe, because I hope to have a lot more content like this on this channel going forward. So just to preface this by saying, I had no intention of doing this channel at the point I did this hunt. It was just all recorded with my cell phone at the time, just for people back home and so forth, and kind of for my own amusement. So it's not exactly the type of content that I'm thinking of having for this channel going forward, but I think there's enough here that you could get some entertainment out of it, and also hopefully some useful information on how to plan a hunt for yourself. First thing I did before actually doing the hunt was, over the summer, I went up to the unit that I'd drawn and I did some scouting. And I think that there was mostly a lot of benefits to that. There was a few things from that scout that ended up kind of unanticipated during my hunt, but overall the scouting was very beneficial. I learned a lot about the land that was up there. Everything there, once you get to the national grassland and start looking around, everything looks like it's the same color. And really the big thing for me that I took back from that is the optics is going to play a major role. The binoculars definitely pay dividends in this type of country, with the color being as just generically brown as it is, and also the distances involved. When you get out there and you just get to this rolling grassland, you can just see for forever. And so being able to see things up close and glass for long periods of time, it's definitely going to be beneficial to have some optics with you, whatever your preference for that might be. And also, your caliber choice comes into play as well. If you're planning on reaching out for some longer distances, you're going to want to have a caliber that you're comfortable shooting, but also it has the terminal ballistics at the types of ranges that you're likely to be shooting at, so that you can successfully harvest a pronghorn when you're ready to take that shot. Now, the next thing is understanding the layout of Pawnee National Grassland, which we have here in Colorado, along with the private land that's going to be present in the unit that you select. The problem with the grassland is it's a lot different if you're used to hunting in a national forest here in Colorado or wherever it is you may live. Whereas the national forest is like this huge area, just thousands of acres of public land that you can get out into. The national grassland isn't like that. There are some larger contiguous areas of national grassland, but a lot of it is smaller, even down to just a section of land or maybe several sections that are next to each other. And easy to access because there's county roads that are going around them and so forth. So understanding that, and then the importance of having a map so you can identify when you're on legal hunting ground. OnX maps is what I came to rely on. Some people still prefer like the old school paper maps, and I get that part, but having some kind of a map resource is going to be absolutely crucial, because a lot of this national grassland, you can't really differentiate it. It's not necessarily marked. A lot of it just looks like pasture land, just like any of the neighboring private land is, because in the off season, the local ranchers will use it for pasture land. So it's going to be just fenced and look like any other kind of pasture that's out there. So being able to identify where you can legally hunt in a reliable method, it was just easy enough for me to get OnX, and that way I could just track myself with a GPS wherever I was driving, and I knew when the national grassland was going to be coming up, and that was a major factor in being able to be successful in this hunt as well. So we had ended up drawing doe tags for this hunt, and based on the scouting that I had found at the time, I scouted this in August, and almost exclusively saw solitary does when I was doing my scouting. So I felt I had like a pretty reasonable chance of success with the amount of animals that I was seeing, and particularly the amount of solitary does that I was seeing. But keep that in mind, because that's going to come up here later as we get into the actual hunt. So the first day of hunting was Saturday for me. It was actually the first afternoon of hunting. I had things to take care of that Saturday morning and drove out and got to the public land Saturday afternoon. So there was a few patches of grassland that I had scouted, and I drove by those, and they already had trucks and orange vests all over them. And so I kept driving north until I found a section of land, a public land that had one pair of hunters on it that was dressing out a carcass right next to the fence line. I pulled the truck. There was a barbed wire gate that you can get access to the public land. So I opened it up, drove the truck onto the public land, and parked. And got a pack on, got my rifle, and just started hiking in. So I parked on the east side and started hiking west along the access trail leading into this public land. Halfway in to my walk into the public land, my first truck drove by on the trail. They were driving from west to east. And at the time, it was kind of an annoyance, but, they waved at me. I waved back at them. And I thought, like, well, geez, this is kind of annoying. Now I'm going to have to wait a while for any animals to come back onto the public land. And as I kept walking west and, taking my time glassing around there, I had a nice hillside that I could look to the south of me. And I was glassing that hillside. And then I was glassing in front of me as I was walking forward, and I wasn't seeing anything. I got to the crest of a kind of a hill line where the hillside was going to drop down in front of me to the west, and another truck came by, and I just sat out there on that hill. I glassed down the hill from me for a while, and I glassed down to the south on that other hillside facing me, and I just waited there. I saw some coyotes. They were chasing some rabbits. There were some cottontails and some jackrabbits out there. But that was the extent of the wildlife I saw. I didn't even see antelope on any private land that was around there. And I think another truck even came by closer to sunset. And that kind of took me to the end of the first afternoon. So second day, Sunday, I drove out to the biggest patch of the national grassland in my unit. And I figured, well, I'll get out there, I'll park the car, and I'll just walk in somewhere where there's no trails. In that way, I have a good chance of somebody not interrupting me and driving by me with the trucks. As I approached the grassland, it may as well have been an RV park, because there was just like a wall of trailers and trucks that was parked out there. And I immediately decided to change my plan. It said it was not worth it. There's going to be guys just all over this place. And, I'm not even the second guy to that party. So I again started driving north and looking for smaller patches of the grassland that hadn't been touched yet. And so for my first real experience with the antelope, I actually recorded some footage afterwards, and this is essentially what happened.
So here's the update from this morning. The first couple places that I went to look were crowded with hunters. So I kept going farther north. I'm almost to Nebraska now. But I found one patch where from the road I could see there were two antelope on public land. So they're legal for me to hunt. And one of them was a buck and one of them was a doe. And I have a doe tag. So I pulled off the road and stopped and was looking at them with binoculars. And they saw me. And this is even from, they were probably, I'm guessing, 700 yards away, maybe 800 yards away. So a long ways away, but, they could see the car. And then when they saw me getting out of the car, they ran into this next section of land. So I pulled the car up to land, and there's a little trail here. It's this one that you see here behind me. And I opened the gate and I started driving down this trail, and I went over a few ridge lines, and I saw them down in actually like this bowl. Let's see if I can get the camera there. So this bowl down in here, that's probably, I don't know, they were about 300 yards away from me. I was able to get my rangefinder, and I think it said 289 yards. But again, when I got out of the car, they saw me and started running again. So I parked the car and I got my rifle and my hunting bag and whatnot, and I started walking off there, let's see, that direction, over that hill. And I went over the hill, they weren't there. So I went to the next ridge line, they weren't there. And the wind's kind of blowing in my, it was blowing as I was walking that direction, the wind was blowing at my back. So it was blowing my scent in the direction I was walking, which is not a good thing. So I was trying to move to my left as I was walking forward, so that I would hopefully, if I came up on them, I would be beside them instead of directly behind them, and that way hopefully they wouldn't get my scent. But apparently they were also moving to the left, because I came up to a ridge line and they were apparently on the other edge of the ridge line. They stood up there maybe 50 yards away from me, really close. But they stood up, and all I really saw was their necks and heads coming up, and they looked at me, and then they took off running. I kept walking a few more ridge lines, and I got to another section of the public land where somebody has cows out there. And as I got there, I saw a coyote running towards me. It scared the cows away, and I figured it probably scared the antelope away wherever they had gone off to. And so the coyote ran around me and ran off to the south. And then not too long after that, a truck came through looking at the cows. So I'm guessing the truck probably scared the coyote, and then the coyote scared everything else. So I just turned around and I walked back to the truck, and now I'm going to move on to the next spot.
So from this experience, I started picking up a few things. First thing is the antelope, once they get bumped, it seems like they don't really run real far. Essentially, they just kind of run far enough to break line of sight with you, and then they stop and wait and kind of, keep checking their surroundings and see if they're being followed or not. The next thing was going to be that managing the wind and my scent was going to play a major role in my success there, because the prevailing wind there blows from west to east. And on most afternoons, that actually kind of shifted to where it would blow out of the northwest instead of from due west, and sometimes even blowing almost north to south by late afternoon instead of from west to east. So being aware of the wind and the direction that my scent was going to be moving was going to be crucial to being able to get on top of some antelope. The other thing was going to be that hunters and trucks and whatnot was just going to be a prevailing factor, sort of no matter where I was going to go. And if I was going to be successful, I was going to have to figure out ways that I could mitigate that as a factor affecting my hunts. Because with the ease of access that there is with these pockets of the national grassland and the county roads that go around them, I was going to have to do a lot of thinking and try to figure out, okay, what's going to be the best way that I can get onto some antelope without somebody else ruining my hunt. So after this, I mostly just spent the rest of the day driving and scouting. I didn't really get to do much actual hunting, and actually for most of the day, I didn't even really get out of the truck. I did end up seeing plenty of antelope. In fact, first thing that morning, as I was even driving up to the national grassland, I saw a huge herd of maybe like a couple, 2-3 dozen antelope that were all right next to this small little town on private land, of course. And that got to be a recurring theme for the day, is that there would be antelope all over the place because there was so much hunting pressure that the antelope were all out and moving around, but they were all on private land. And they were staring at you from the other side of a fence line. And as I spent more time out in the grasslands, kind of looking around with my binoculars and everything, it was almost just a constant convoy of trucks that were circling every county road, every off-road trail that was in the grasslands, and it was just nonstop for the whole day. So I got to see a lot of antelope and see kind of where, like, the areas where they were hanging out, but didn't even come close to getting a chance at actually hunting one because of the overwhelming hunting pressure that there was on the public land in my unit. So that night I got out my phone and I just spent a while looking at my Onyx map for the unit and trying to think to myself, okay, if I'm going to try to combine managing the wind factor and managing the other hunters as a factor, I concluded that probably the best thing for me to do, I would need to access these little patches of the public grassland on either the southeast or northeast corners and walk in, so that if I was on the eastern side, the wind would be blowing from west to east, and so my scent wouldn't be affecting anything that might be on the public land where I was going to be, right? And also, if I was starting from that side, on the eastern side, any vehicles that might drive by on the western side, if they're bumping animals, those animals would turn and run east, and they would get pushed towards me. So it would mitigate my scent as a factor, and it would do the best that it could to mitigate the other hunters as a factor. And I was trying to find sections of the public land where that eastern side, either if I was going to hit it on the northeast corner or the southeast corner, that eastern side bordered public land, but there was no public right-of-way going between them. Like there was no county road, essentially, or hopefully even a driveway, to someone's ranch or something. It was just a fence line that was dividing between the private land on one side and then the public land on the other side. So Monday morning, I drove up to my top candidate, a patch of public land there that was, I think it was about 5 or 6 sections of grassland that were all contiguous. And for reference, a section is 640 acres of land. It's essentially 1 mile long by 1 mile wide. I drove up to my first section that had fit this criteria that I had been looking for, and I stopped at the southeast corner and crawled under the fence and started walking up that very eastern fence line on the public land and private land to the east of me, to my right. So I started walking up this fence line. So about a mile in, this antelope popped up about 200 yards in front of me. Totally surprised me, because when you're out there, it's very deceptive. You think you can look all around and see for huge distances, which you can, but the topography is rolling. So you see the high points, but then there's low points you don't see until you get right up to the crest of that ridge line. You can see down into it. And that's what happened to me. I came up to the crest, and suddenly this antelope had popped up and was staring straight at me. Now, this antelope was a buck, so I knew it wasn't legal for me to shoot. I only had the doe tag. But I sat there and watched it for a while, partly because I just wanted to see how he responded to me, partly because I was hoping that there would be a doe that might be bedded down there with him, and that she might pop up, and then I could get a shot on her. So I just stood there for probably somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes, and we just stared at each other. And eventually he moved to a higher ridge line and stared at me again for a while. And he moved to the next farthest one away, which is probably 450, 500 yards, something like that. And then stood up there on the ridge line staring at me. And so long as I didn't move, he didn't seem, startled or anything. He wasn't scared. I made sure I only moved whenever he moved. And, it didn't, so long as I maintained that, he didn't really seem to care. He was more curious, honestly, than anything, that I was there, and mostly just seemed like he wanted to check me out and try to figure out what I was. So eventually he disappeared to the far side of that ridge line that he had run up to. And since no doe or anything else got up and followed him, I figured he must have been solitary, so I kept on walking. I kept following that fence line all the way up to the far northern edge of the public land that I was on. And I had my breakfast. I glassed for a long time, just checking out the surroundings and whatnot. About noon, I packed out, went back to the truck. I drove by several other sections of public land that were kind of nearby to where I was, but they were all empty as well. And by that point, I figured, probably everything's already been bumped off of the public land. So I drove back into town. I got some lunch. And after that, I went back. I'd already had a few early mornings in a row. So I just went back, took a nap, and just called it a day for that day. The other thing that was affecting me, although I didn't know it at the time, was I'd actually had a hip injury that I was dealing with kind of over the course of the summer. And it had been misdiagnosed a couple times as a back injury. So the anti-inflammatories that I was taking really weren't doing anything to help with the pain that was going down my leg. And after doing quite a bit of walking that morning, it was really aggravated, and that would also continue to play a role for me for the rest of my hunt. So day 4 for me was Tuesday. I hiked into the same spot, kept going back to that same patch of national grassland that I'd found. I hiked in, my buck wasn't back there again that morning, so I just hiked all the way up that fence line to the northern boundary. I stood there and glassed for a while, and not much had changed. So at that point, I decided that I would start heading west and see if anything changed if I started moving farther west and into that part of the grassland.
So here's what I've accomplished so far this morning. Right behind me, actually probably about right now directly behind me this way, about 600-700 yards, there's a pair of antelope. It's a buck and a doe. I've got a doe tag, so she would be a good shooter for me, but there's a fence and that side of it's private land. And now I could, I could walk along the fence line and then cut that way in about 1.5 miles. Actually more about a mile. It'd be about 1 mile that way, and then I'd cut north about 0.5 mile, maybe 1/4 mile, and I would actually be closer to them. I'd probably be within, 300-400 yards. And then if they came across the public land line, I could take a shot, but the wind would be blowing my scent straight towards them, and I bet they just run farther back into the private land. So I'm going to just camp out here and watch them a while and see what direction they go. And then I may turn around and head back. I'm about 2 miles into the public land right now, actually maybe a little bit farther than that. But there was another there were some mule deer with a few antelope that all kind of herded together. And I would actually have a better vantage point on them because there's a hill where I can sit and watch them, and they might come over into the public land. So I got to make a call here which group of animals I decide to follow. So here's the update. Well, I kept moving west a little bit, and I came across a couple mule deer, and I realized I wouldn't be able to go much farther west because then the mule deer would send me. They'd get up and go. And as soon as they left, the antelope would go. So I just sat and watched the mule deer and the antelope for, half hour or so. And the longer I've sat here, the more mule deer there are that have come out. There's like this low-lying ravine, and more of them come up, and there's some huge bucks there. There's one of them in particular has a massive set of antlers. This is the biggest set of antlers easily I've seen in person. And they're just totally unconcerned. They could, pretty much care less that I'm here. The antelope were chasing each other around. It was kind of fun to watch. They were playing out there, zooming around the field, and they kept slowly migrating farther and farther away. And then just a little bit ago, they took off deep into Nebraska. So I'm going to head out, and I'm going to go check on this other herd that I found. And, the herd probably seems like it's bigger than it really is. There's probably, 8 or 10 individuals. And I'm going to see where they ended up at. But it was really cool seeing these mule deer and watching those antelope play around. It's kind of a fun morning.
So at lunch, I hiked out again. Drove by several pieces of grassland, some of the same ones that I'd been visiting before, just kind of trying to keep tabs on what was happening there. But eventually drove back into town, kind of had a later lunch, and again, just rested up for the remainder of the day. And that pain in my leg continued escalating by that point, and I was just trying to minimize the wear and tear on it. I don't like admitting it, but I was even kind of considering maybe leaving the hunt early. I had until Thursday to hunt before I had to go back for other deadlines. But I was even considering, going back early, maybe just hunting a short day the following day, and then just calling it quits, or maybe even heading back that night because my leg was really starting to bother me by that point. So for day 5, I went back to the same spot again. I hiked in, I crawled under the fence, I started hiking up that fence line, and not 20 or 30 yards into it, I came across a bunch of sign. Fresh sign. I mean, I'd been in and out of there every day, so I knew that it was fresh. And actually, it was so fresh, like there was some urine marks there that were still damp on the ground. So it was, very recent scat and urine that was there. And unfortunately, that was kind of discouraging because I knew if it was that recent, I ought to be able to see these animals. And since I wasn't seeing them, it was pretty clear that they'd probably been bumped and I wasn't going to get a shot at them. So really actually kind of unfortunate for me coming across this, but I was, determined. I was like, well, I'm already out here. I may as well do the hike in, and who knows, maybe they just decided to run north and, I'll run into them farther into the grassland. So I just hiked up that fence line, and it was actually kind of an interesting experience for me after dealing with everything that was going on with my leg. And then coming here and having this disappointing thing, finding this sign, and knowing that, there was obviously a good opportunity there not too long ago, but, it had gone. I was kind of processing that disappointment, and I kind of came to this interesting, like, Zen moment where I just sort of accepted, it's like, well, whatever is going to happen is going to happen. And there's nothing that I'm going to be able to do to change that. And all I can really do is just kind of do the best I can and enjoy the process. And once I came to that mindset, it was really a different experience for me. I didn't really, even though my leg was in pain, I wasn't really paying attention to it as much. Even the pictures I was taking that morning were some of the best pictures that I ended up having from the trip. So it was just kind of this cool experience being out there and just sort of accepting my fate, I guess you might say. So I hiked in, got to the northern edge of that fence line. I hiked west again, glassed for a while. I found the same herd of mule deer that I'd found the day before. They hadn't moved real far, but they were out there on the grassland, on the private land. I found the one solitary buck antelope. He had lost the doe that he had been flirting with the day before. He was out there all by his lonesome, just sort of hanging out near the mule deer. I watched them for a while, and none of them really moved significantly. They seemed content to be where they were. So I didn't wait real long. Probably about 8:30 or so, I started hiking back out to the truck. And actually, as I got to the truck, I saw another truck of hunters open a gate and drive onto a trail onto that same patch of grassland that I had just hiked. So I knew, like, if anything was there, they were just about to get bumped. So I decided I would drive around to a few more pieces of grassland. There was one piece actually kind of on the western side of where I had just been hunting that I wanted to check out. And that one was kind of interesting because it ran north all the way to Nebraska. So I looped around, found the next kind of county road south, and looped around and drove west. Came north again on the next county road, and as I was going north, I ran into a small group of antelope. I knew it was 3. They were out on the public land next to a water hole that had been set up there on the public land. So as soon as I pulled my truck over, they saw me. They ran off to a clump of trees that was sort of on the low side of a little hill that was there. But I didn't see them run any farther than that. So I knew that they must have been hiding out in those trees. So I just parked the truck. I didn't want to drive on to the grassland or anything. I knew better than that by that point. So I just sort of pulled the truck over, grabbed the rifle out, crawled under the fence, and I started walking up this hill to get a look down into the trees. So when I came over the crest of that hill, 2 of the antelope took off immediately. It was a buck and a doe. They just shot out, as fast as they could run. They just took off north. Eventually, way up ahead, they crossed the road and ran across to the west side of that road into some private land. And so I knew there was only one of them left because I was very certain that I'd seen three of them out there taking off from the water hole. So I pulled my rifle up and I was just sort of glassing around through my scope to see if I could figure out where that third one went. And as I was doing that, the third one ran out a little bit, and he turned out to be another buck. So, solitary buck. And again, he only ran out to about 200 yards or so away from me and then just sat there staring at me. And so I just watched him for a while because, again, it's kind of the first opportunity I'd had for a while to watch these animals up close, and I just wanted to see how he responded to me. And it was very consistent with the experience I'd had from a couple days before, where he just hung out at about 200 yards and watched me for a while, and eventually he ran out a little bit more to say 300, 350, and sat there watching me some more and just sort of waited to see what I would do. And then eventually he kind of ran off in the same direction that his friends had gone, and that was that. Kind of a similar experience to behavior that I'd seen before, where paired bucks and does are going to run immediately. Like their number one goal is to just get out of there, right? Whereas a solitary buck ends up being more curious and kind of wants to check you out and try to figure out what you are. And that one made a good example because it was a nice juxtaposition since they were right there next to each other, and you could see the difference in behavior between these two different types of antelope. So after that, went back to the truck, put the gun back in the case, and I was sort of checking out my Onyx maps, and there was one little patch of grassland. It was only like a section and a half that was not too far away from where I was. But that Sunday afternoon, when I had been driving around scouting, I had come across a small herd of, say, like maybe 6 or so antelope that had been hanging out on private land right next to, like adjacent to this little patch of public grassland. So I figured, well, I'll go over and check this out. I haven't been over there since Sunday, and we'll see where that little herd ended up at. I drove in. This county road that I was driving in on was going to shoot me up to the northeast corner of that little section of the grassland. And as I was pulling up to that intersection, I could see it was kind of like this low hill that goes up to the middle of the grassland and then kind of slopes back down the other side. And on that hillside, I could see two antelope that were actually bedded down there, and they were watching me pull up on the truck. So I knew that they were probably used to seeing vehicles. There was a lot of energy development that was sort of a little bit north of there. So there was trucks and stuff like that using those roads a lot. So I figured they're used to seeing vehicles pull up to this intersection. So I just grabbed my binoculars really quick and glassed to make sure one of those was a legal doe for me. And it was a buck and a doe that were paired up, and they were bedded down on that hillside. So I put the binoculars down and turned left and started driving down south along that eastern fence line of the grassland. And I got to where the ridgeline of the hill blocked them from view of my truck so that I could get out, when I was out of their line of sight. And since I was on the eastern side of that unit and the wind was blowing from west to east, the wind was also covering my scent. So I grabbed the rifle out again, crawled under the fence line, and I started kind of like this low crouch going up the side of that hill. I was intentionally going slow because I'd felt like the time before, well, they were sort of already spooked from my truck in the first place, but they hadn't really run that far. They'd only run to like this little clump of trees, and I feel like it was me coming over the hillside too quickly that had startled them again, and they had taken off running. So this time I was going a lot slower, and I was crouching down as much as I could, kind of like this low crouching walk to keep myself as low on the horizon as possible. And as I was coming up to the crest of the hill, I even dropped down on my knees, and I was sort of like army crawling for like the next, say like 20 yards or so till I could get line of sight on them. And even despite all of that, by the time I got line of sight on them, they were already standing up and they were looking straight in my direction. So somehow they still knew that I was there. But I managed to crawl to within 196 yards of them. At one point I got my rangefinder on. It was 196 yards to them. But they at least didn't take off running. They clearly knew that something was up because they would kind of prance around a little bit, and then they'd stop and they'd look in my direction and try to keep an eye on what was going on. So they knew something was happening. but they at least didn't take off running. So I had a chance to watch them for a while, and I actually, ditched the rangefinder and everything I had because I was going to be crawling from there on out. And I tried to inch a little bit closer to them. Whenever they'd prance around, I'd inch, a little bit closer, and then eventually I'd stop. They'd turn and look at me, and I'd have to wait. But one of the primary difficulties that I was having to deal with was as soon as they, I guess, knew that I was there, or knew something was up, they moved to the ridge line of the hill. So while I was watching them, they were silhouetted against the skyline. So I didn't have a safe shot to take. I had to wait for them to come down so they'd have a safe background for me to shoot on. And so it was probably around 10 minutes or so that I was out there watching them and, waiting for a chance to get my shot. And the other problem was that being as low as I was, because I had been crawling that whole time, the natural vegetation that was there in the grassland wouldn't let me get a clear shot with my rifle. So I was going to have to take the shot kneeling. I couldn't shoot from a prone position. So I had to wait for them to look away, and I'd kind of slowly start working my way up to a kneeling position. They'd look at me and I'd have to stop, and I slowly got up to a kneeling position, and then I got my rifle on them, and then I was watching them and having to wait for them to come down the ridge line. So amongst all of this, different stuff, all these different variables that I was trying to manage, plus your body's kind of natural response of like you naturally want to hold your breath while you're concentrating on something, my heart rate had started getting elevated. And shooting from this kneeling position, no bipod, nothing to brace on, no branches or rocks or anything I could brace on. It was just going to be a kneeling position, and my heart rate up. My rifle kept doing this. And, at 200 yards, even with, full zoom, it's an awful lot of movement. So even then, once they came down from the ridgeline, I had to take a few moments and do some breathing techniques to bring my heart rate down so that my rifle would settle down, the reticle and my scope would settle down to the point where I could get a clean shot on this animal. And when I did, actually, I was pretty happy with the shot. It's kind of one of the few times out hunting where it was really a surprise trigger break. When I tripped off the trigger, it was my ears were actually ringing before I'd realized that I'd actually tripped it off. So it was a good trigger pull. And by the time I got to that point, the shooting was the easy part. Essentially, everything worked the way it was supposed to, and we ended up with this doe on the ground. So as I got up next to her and saw, what it actually looked like, I was glad that I had waited to take the shot until I had a solid background behind my target, because even though I had hit her, this shot went through and through. And if she had been against the skyline, that projectile would have kept on going to who knows where. And so it's a good hunter safety practice to make sure that you have a solid background behind where you're shooting. So major talking points from this whole experience for me. The first one is the pronghorn behavior. Okay, so in summer when I went out to scout, it was almost exclusively solitary does that I was seeing, and their behavior as solitary does was very similar to the bucks that I encountered during the hunting season. They seemed mostly curious. They were content to watch me, didn't seem really too concerned. But by the time the hunting season rolled around in October, these animals were already pairing up. And it seems like once they're paired up, the bucks have a vested interest in protecting the does that they have with them because they have intentions for them. So if there's anything out of place, they're just going to want to take off running and get their lady friends out of there. The solitary bucks, on the other hand, seem more curious. And if they're there and they're just sort of sitting there watching you, then you'll probably have better opportunities at those solitary bucks because they're more curious and they're not really so worried about getting away from you so long as you don't do anything crazy. In addition to that, it's very clear that they understand vehicles and what vehicles are. Because there was several ones that I bumped where I was either in my vehicle, didn't even get out, or I pulled up and just got out of my vehicle and they knew the game was on and so they were running. So it's not worth taking your vehicle onto public land to try to get close to these antelope because they're going to be gone. And you'll get a good look at pronghorn who are running away from you if that's what you want to see. But if you really want to be able to hunt them and bring them down, it doesn't pay to bring your vehicle out there because all you're going to end up doing is bumping the pronghorn onto private land, and you're going to miss opportunities, and you're probably going to spoil opportunities for other people. So the next one is the terrain factors. And I mentioned this before, but the topography there is very deceptive because you can see for miles in almost any direction you look. But just because you can see for miles, something that's just miles and miles away, there's also like these rolling pockets of land where you can't see down into the low-lying areas until you get right up next to them. And it seems like these antelope are either going to be on a ridge line where they can, kind of have a commanding view of the area, or they're going to be in these low-lying pockets where they're out of sight of people and they feel safe, like you're not going to come up and hunt them because you can't see them, they can't see you. So most of these hunting situations that I ended up in, they developed very, very fast. Like they're like this. Like 1 minute you think you're alone and by yourself, and all of a sudden there's an antelope there. So I feel like it pays to really slow down your pace of hunting, and you're not just hoofing it into the public grassland somewhere, because very likely, like you're, going to break the horizon. They're going to realize that you're there. They're probably going to take off running, especially if they're paired up or whatever. So it pays to go at a slower pace, where you can maintain like a better awareness of the area around you and you don't scare the antelope away. The next one I've explained before, but again, the wind factors. Understanding that the prevailing wind's most likely going to be blowing west to east. It may change somewhat depending on the time of day or maybe depending on the specific topography of where you are. But being aware of your prevailing wind patterns and then trying to figure out, okay, how do I access my public land so that I can mitigate these wind factors or maybe even have the wind working in my favor. And for me, that even came down to adapting my driving habits. So I would even try to drive up. I was staying south of my hunting unit. So as I was driving north, I would drive up on the northeast side of the hunting unit so that throughout the day, as I would start working my way west, checking out new sections of the grassland, I knew that I would be arriving at new sections of the grassland on the eastern side, so that if I saw antelope, I could get out of the truck and be accessing the land from that eastern side, and the wind would always be working in my favor. And bear in mind, that actually is what paid off for me on day 5, my final day of hunting, because I arrived on that eastern side. I was able to see the antelope. I was able to access from that eastern side, so the wind was always blowing my scent away from them. And I feel like that was a huge part of the success that I had, was making sure that I was managing my wind and the scent properly. So the next one is the people factors. Hunting pressures was way higher on the weekends for me than it was during the week. So there's probably just a lot of hunters that either live nearby or, Denver wasn't too terribly far away, where they just figure out, well, we'll drive out for the weekend, do some hunting, and then we'll drive back and go back to work. So there was definitely way more weekend pressure than there was weekday pressure. And this variable you really don't have control of. People will drive onto the public land. There's no way to stop them. And I think as time progresses, they start getting more desperate and they'll start driving more onto the public land to try to find these antelope. And really what they're going to do is they're going to bump all the antelope off onto private land. So I feel like, probably on the weekends, if I was going to do this again, I would probably hunt mornings on the weekends and then not even bother coming back out, afternoons, because everything's so heavily pressured that they're just off of the public land and they're not going to come back until after dark. During the weekdays, if my leg had been feeling better, I would have probably stayed out there more in the afternoons and evenings. But as it is, I still feel like your best hunting opportunities are going to be in the mornings when they've had an evening to kind of reset. They don't feel the pressure. So they feel a little bit more comfortable in those mornings being out there until something comes along and bumps them off into the private land. So I feel like probably the best thing that you can do to navigate this variable is to just try to be places where other hunters aren't. Particularly the trucks. Try to be where the trucks aren't going to be. So you're going to try to find little areas of the public land that aren't near the off-road trails or aren't near public rights of way, so that you know that the only people you're competing with are people that are willing to get out and hike just like you are. And that way, if you're there the earliest and you're the one that's getting access to the public land first, you have a better chance of getting your antelope. So the next thing is using your time in the field to learn. So I stopped and waited for antelope, even though I knew they weren't legal for me to shoot, but just because I wanted the experience of observing these pronghorn, and I wanted to see how they responded to me. I wanted to see how they responded to other variables in their environment. And I feel like that, plus taking advantage of the opportunities I had for scouting, even during times when I knew like the likelihood that I would be able to hunt was pretty low, like particularly that Sunday afternoon. And in fact, that's a point that's worth mentioning, because where I actually did end up shooting my antelope was a place that I'd scouted that Sunday afternoon when the hunting pressure was overwhelming, and I was just driving around just trying to find local information and knowing that I probably wouldn't have much of a chance of hunting anything that day. But that work that I'd put in that Sunday paid off on Wednesday morning when I came back there and I finally did get a chance to hunt something. So just finding these little opportunities to learn and keep developing yourself and your understanding of the unit, your understanding of the animals and so forth, that just makes you a more competent hunter the longer that you're able to do that. So finally here, I'm going to put up a little diagram that I created. It describes how I've learned to operate in my professional endeavors, but it's applicable to virtually all aspects of life, including hunting. I call this process the foraging process, and it starts with the idea phase. And in this instance, the idea is really simple. It's I want to hunt pronghorn. And from there, you start to focus in on that idea, and you say like, okay, not only do I want to hunt pronghorn, I want to hunt a pronghorn doe in Colorado in this unit, during this season with this rifle, with this pack, etc. Right? So you get that focused in to the point where you can actually start performance, which means I'm going out and I'm hunting. I'm looking for these things and I want to try to shoot one. And inevitably, and I'm sure we're all familiar with this by this point, inevitably you're going to start running into obstacles into actually what it is you're trying to do with your performance. So in this case, the pronghorn are behaving differently than they did when I was scouting, right? And other hunters are driving everywhere, and my leg was killing me. Okay, so once you start encountering these obstacles, you start moving into recovery phase. And that's sort of a phase where you have to accept that everything that you'd planned up to this point, it isn't going to work the way that you'd planned it, right? You have to get to the point where you can accept that. And once you kind of navigate that recovery and come to acceptance of it, you get to what I call refining, where you take that original plan, you say, okay, now that I know that that original idea isn't going to work, how can I take what I've learned and use it to come up with an even better idea, right? So I study the maps differently, and I access the land differently, and I try to stock differently, and so forth. And eventually, maybe after a few iterations of this, or maybe after many iterations of this, you end up forging an idea that lets you be successful at what it was you were originally trying to do, right? And not only can you be successful at it, it makes you a more competent person, makes you a more resilient person, because you're used to overcoming hardships. That's what I've got for you today, and hopefully you found something that's useful out of that you can take and you can apply to your own hunting experiences. And thank you guys for watching. Again, if you enjoyed this video, you found it was useful, like and subscribe, and I'm going to have more content for you coming up shortly.